Hi, this is Justin Spring. I wanted to take a little break today and take a little look at why I'm doing what I'm doing, which for many people, from some of the comments I've heard from people who have dropped in on the session, is what the hell is this all about, you know? And I had a friend who was a pretty good poet the other day stopped me and said, what are you doing? You're talking about the mother goddess, and it's the same as the muse, and it goes back to pre-literate tribal peoples and antiphonal poetry and music and uh, the unconscious and you want to just write the poems like everybody else does, you know, forget about it. I said, well, you know, he had a good point, because I don't think that in terms of the books that have really taken a look at poetry from a poet's point of view, I don't know of many, at least that really try to take a look at the origins of poetry and ask us, why is a poem a poem? You know, what makes a poem, and why is it like it is so unique and something that's lasted for so long, you know, through the ages, where it's a kind of standard form, you know, it can be played with, but in the end it has its essential kernel. It's the same thing. And it's gone through different cultures, and it's everywhere. It's human, you know. And most poets, including myself, didn't really think about it at all. You know, it was just something that happened. It was a rush of words and story and music and rhythm that came, and you tried to get it down on paper and as just best you could. And it was a very tricky task, by the way, because the conscious mind is always in there and always screwing around, where in fact it shouldn't be screwing around. The trick was to stay suspended on some kind of golden thread of consciousness and unconsciousness and let the muse have her way with you, which is very difficult, because writing itself is a very conscious act compared to speaking, which is where I made my breakthrough. So that really what happens in effect is that unless you're given a reason to examine something, you just accept it. Well, it's a given. It's like, I don't know, it's like my nails grow, or if I eat too much I got a stomach ache, and sometimes a poem comes to me, I don't know where it comes from, I just write it down and I get it published and people like it, or nobody reads it, whatever the whole story is that you'll hear from poets. And some are highfalutin and some are nonsense, and you know, some are right from the heart. But the fact of the matter is that unless something upsets the apple cart, there's nobody going to really ask about the apples. And my apple cart was upset when I started to do an oral poetry. I didn't do it thinking I would ever go down the road I've gone down. I did it to try to improve my performance at poetry readings, which are deadly, as we all know. I wanted to have the poem come to me as I spoke it to people. I knew the poets had done this in the past. I didn't know how they did it. There's no books you can really read on it, you know. I happened to come across the Little of Graves about it and the White Goddess, but that didn't really help me. He's looking at it from a kind of scholarly point of view, and he goes back to the fact that it's very early roots in the mother goddess pre-literate cultures, and the mother goddess is really the muse, and a poem occurs when the poet accidentally hits one of the 13 themes used to praise the mother goddess, and which is a very late stage of pre-literate culture, by the way, to have that kind of thing, you know, 13 themes. But anyway, it was a stab at it, and it was a pretty accurate stab too, even though the book was unreadable. And then there was always the work of Julian Jaynes, who suggested that poets are a kind of remnant, or have a remnant of a consciousness that existed in pre-literate man, where he heard voices from the right side of his brain that had a language faculty which is now defunct, and he took to be the voices of the gods, and one of those was the voice of the muse, who spoke, as Homer says, "Sing, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending," which is how the Odyssey begins. So he was invoking the muse to rise up and to not only give him inspiration, but to actually supply the words, which is what every real good poet hears. A poet who is not faking it, who has allowed or who's been lucky enough to have the muse come and speak. And the speaking is always a little garbled. Sometimes you can hear it very clearly as someone speaking to you in a very special way. It's not one of your own interior voices, those thinking voices, and you'll sometimes get pictures, and you'll sometimes have the words just appear on your lips, and you'll speak them out, or on your pen if you're writing it out. It happens in a jumble, just like any other story that you tell, whether it's gossip or humor that you're making up for the first time. Let me put it that way. That you're basically unconscious when you do it. You're not thinking. If you think, you're going to blow the story. You're going to blow the gossip, or you're going to blow the humor. You have to really operate on an unconscious level, and because that's the only way that the truth eventually comes out. And that's the same with a poem, but the poem comes from a deeper level. It doesn't come from our conscious memories and minds. It comes from some deeper part and brings in a little bit of the conscious mind to do it. And when it does, we have something that is miraculous, which is called a poem. It has certain kinds of properties. One is when it comes to you, it has a feeling of truth and beauty. They're intermixed, like Keats says, truth is beauty and beauty is truth. That's all you know and all you need to know. I think that that's kind of close enough. That's what he's really talking about. They're intertwined. It's a moment of ecstasy. It's close to an orgasm. And it's immediately recognized by the recipient as something special. It's not a joke. It's not gossip. This is something special, which is why poets will show it to you. They'll bore you to death. Look what came to me. This is, even a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, a little poem, or 11-year-old wants to show it to you. They know it's important. This is a gift. Something came from somewhere that was not their normal self. They don't know what it is, but they instinctively know that it's of importance. Real importance. Even people who don't know what God is, or been brought up in some kind of society where only the scientific exists, they know it's not scientific. Something that, in fact, the word they'll be searching for is divine. That's the sense you have of it. That's from a higher level. But that's what happens to poets. Yet poets, you see very little kind of talking about it, mainly because when you get down to the nuts of the matter, it's a psychic event. And today, most of our poets live in academic worlds where you don't want to talk about that. That's, not in the scientific world, So it's, no. We don't want to hear about that. But that's really at its root, it's a psychic experience. That it comes unbidden, and it brings with it a moment of revelation. You could call it a special type of vision. If you don't get the ecstasy, and if it doesn't come to you unbidden, it's not a poem. It's something you made up. It's nice, it's disturbing, or it's exciting, but it's not a poem. And the mark of a poem is that it makes us whole, it comforts us, it brings the two halves of us together. It's a mating, and it has the same comfort that any mating does. Think of your own matings that you've had in the bodily sense. And I think if you try to relate the two, if you've had a poem come to you, and if you've had an orgasm, hopefully with another human being, where the two of you become one, that's very close to what happens in a poem, except the two parts are within you. There's your conscious self and your unconscious self. But the feeling is exactly the same. And it's an automatic process, just like sex is. Once you surrender to it, it just goes to its completed end. So, when that happened to me in the realm of spoken poetry, and I found out if I just simply got out of the way, if I had enough courage to get out of the way and not worry about what the poem was going to be about, because you can never tell, and you can never break it. Once a poem starts to come to you speaking, you have to stick with it, come hell or high water, because if you break it, there's no going back and trying to rebuild it up again, or erasing it or changing it or whatever you want to do with it, to fart around with it. You have to go from the beginning. When it comes in with that loud bell, when it just rises up inside you, you have to go with it all the way. You have to stay on the golden thread as the muse unrolls the poem for you. That's the best way I can say it. Unrolls it. And it comes out as a story. And it comes out with a special rhythmic force, and it comes out with a special ecstatic power that jokes don't have and that gossip doesn't have. They have their own little powers, but they're nothing like this one. This is the one that brings you heaven blazing into the head, as Jade said. Once that happened to me, and I saw that all that happened without any of the technique or poses or schemata that's associated with written poetry, all of the forms and poses, the common man, the downtrodden man, the disembodied voice from years ago, all the schemata of stanzas and line lengths and metrical beats that come together, those are all thrown out because the unconscious doesn't care about those. It works much as dreams work. It wants to come out. It comes out much like you would say some of Frost's longer narrative poems. Death of the Hard Man or After Apple Picking, something like that. It comes out with that iambic force, but it's much more sophisticated than it is when even somebody like Frost, who is very, very speech-like. When you actually hear him speak it, it's not quite speech, but when you speak something, it is speech. You can't speak in any other way. You're an autopilot. And what you have is that same iambic rhythm, but it's more flexible and more forceful, I would say. It's just more organic. It just gets to you. And you can actually feel the poem as you make it start to rise to that ecstatic state. I mean, it's a total body experience. And it's happening. All you have to do is stay with it, and you have to keep relaying what is coming to you. You're a midwife, you're a relay person, you're giving birth to the baby, and the baby appears and pops right out and stands up and say, there. And that baby is a joining of the feelings of your conscious self and your unconscious self coming together. It's a communication. Both the unconscious mind takes something back from it, and so does the conscious mind. It's the way we stay connected. It's the way we stay connected for tens and tens and tens of thousands of years. It happens automatically. Once that happens to you, then you get all kinds of questions come into your mind. And of course you can let them go, but I'm just never one to let things go. Once I saw that, and I saw that this was something that was really poetry in its purest form, before poetry became literature, when poetry was poetry. Let me put it to you that way, okay? Before it got all of the trappings of literature and all those things that poets use to make it come alive on the page as a written document, and they are required sometimes, by the way, too. But it's a tricky business. Dressing the baby during birth is a very tricky business, and after birth is very tricky, too. And since I found that in speaking a poem, it required very little, like none, no conscious interference whatsoever, the poem would appear. In the case, because we now have computers, it could be recorded, and it was right there. Not only myself, but other poets and children of all ages and people of all ages, I taught some very simple techniques, and they were able to do it too. And I became convinced that it was a human, that to make a poem, and that's what the earliest Greek term for poetry, the earliest, it's archaic. It's simply poiein, to make. Not metaphors, not similes. It's to make a little world. And that's what poetry really does. It makes a world, and it comes directly from the unconscious. You don't have to do anything with it. You just have to let it be made. It's going to be made, and you'll have it. So it's to make worlds. That's what I interpret to make to mean, since it's the Greeks were always very precise, and we're never adding little things on it. It's that the important thing about a poem was to make, that there was a making of a world is how I interpret it to be. And it happened. You didn't have to know anything more about it than that. It's to allow it to be made by allowing a muse to rise up. Sing, muse, and through me tell the story, says Homer. He's asking the muse to join him, the unconscious to join him, and to tell that great story of Odysseus or the story of the Iliad. Or any other little small story. People think that in pre-literate times all we had was big epics, but that's crazy. That's like there's only King Lear in Shakespearean times. Where there's an ocean and there's a big fish, there's always little fish. Believe me, that's the way it works in the world. So there were many, many, many types of poems, but there are always story poems, or there are always refrain poems, because that's the only way that the mind works unconsciously, is story form. And the way you can play with it a bit, but very little, is to tell very small stories that repeat themselves over and over and over. Such as, I was standing by the river, and I missed you. I was standing by the river and I remembered you. I was standing by the river and I was holding your hand. I was standing by the river and you were standing next to me. That's a repeat with a hook. Very easily done. The unconscious supplies the hook. You have to think about it. And then the best repetitive things, they become so much a part of that culture. I'm talking about early, very early tribal things that they go on for tens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. They just become something that's always added on to them, which is very important to understand. Is that in the moment of conception, I'm talking about speaking poems too, is that so people understand what I'm talking about, because the poets will, or they should, or maybe they don't. Some of them just, it's hard to say as to what they're doing, really, frank about it. But when the poem comes to you, it's always in a jumble. And that somehow forms a cohesive whole if you're able to stay on a golden thread as the muse unrolls it, and either write it if you're highly flexible and can write very quickly, but speaking is much better. It's an unconscious act, as I've said before. You don't have to be there to let it happen. You can just stay on that thread as it comes through. Let it roll. The poem will rise and fall and close in an ecstatic moment all by itself, and it'll happen with two people as well, which is really, in the end, knocked me out. When I and my partner, Syl Liscombe, started to do poems together, without any preconception of what we were going to say, and all of a sudden her responding, her adding to what I was saying, okay? To return the feeling is what antiphonal means, okay? To return the feeling. That there's a feeling being generated in the main story, and she would come in and she would return the feeling. It's like adding to the story without any thinking. It just happens. You know, it's like a second. It's a fugue, like in Bach. Think of it that way, but it's with words, and there's no thinking involved. It's as musical as Bach would have done it. That's it, bingo. No thinking, and it's done in real time, together. You know, I'm sure Bach did them together too. Left hand, right hand. You know, let them roll. That's the way it works when the muse comes to you. When I discovered all of that, and it had none of the characteristics of written poems. In fact, if you tried to introduce them, that consciousness, the posing, the structure or rhyming of the rhyming schemes or stuff like that, it just fell apart. You had to give the unconscious its way, and the way it came out would be the closest thing I can really give it to you in the world of written poetry is a long narrative by Frost, which pretty much, you know, came their own way. It was in a very easy iambic, was very speech-like, not as quite as speech-like as they are in spoken poems, but it had that kind of inevitable flow that you have. Once you see that, and you see that your poetry is really an archetype, it's an ideal form that exists within us somehow. You can say that the muse is the poem, is whatever it happens to be. It doesn't make any difference. Just like the story is an ideal form that's within us, or it's an archetype, or it's a part of our nature. You can call it anything you want, because we can't speak except in stories. If I want to tell you something, if I want to relate feeling, I have to tell you a story. And it might be a funny story, or it might be gossip, or it might be, and I have no choice in this because it's going to come to me. When the unconscious chooses to tell its story, it comes as a poem. And it forms itself, and it ends itself, and it closes itself in a moment of ecstasy. If we allow it to. If you have the courage to ride with it. You have to ride that horse. You have to ride the white mare. To take a little play on Graves. You have to ride the white mare. All the way home to the barn, you know. And you have to take your chances emotionally. You could go anywhere, you know. So a lot of people say, they tell me, oh, that's all nonsense. But, you know, they're scared to death of it, you know. And I don't blame them. It is scary. But once you see that the result is always beautiful, you don't care about the scary. You don't care about the exposure. You don't care about any of that. What you're going to be after is the beauty, because truth is beauty, beauty is truth. That's all you know. That's all you need to know. The truth is beautiful, and in fact, the beautiful is true. It just comes together. There's no doubting it, and it just ends in a moment of ecstasy, which is almost identical to what we feel when we have an orgasm, because it's a mating of the two parts of us. Once that came to me over a period of years, as I got deeper and deeper into the poetry, then all kinds of questions began to pop in my mind. things I read about Graves and things that I had read of Jane's, they who in fact had no experience with oral poetry in terms of conceiving it and doing it, all those things seem to come together, and they fed me in various ways until I began to see that poetry is the most natural form of communication we have. It's not literature. That's a later accreted form that it has. Poetry in its oral form is the butterfly in flight, and poetry in the written form is the beautiful desiccated dried butterfly pinned to the wall. That's how I feel the difference between the two. It depends on what beauty you like. I like both, but I prefer to be with the butterfly as it flies. Nothing better, So once you see that, then all the things that you've been taught about poetry make sense, but only half sense, because you see poems can be made without any of that nonsense. And I would call it nonsense too, because that's how I came to really feel about it. Because if you have two ways of making poems, and one is fulfills both your human needs and your needs as a poet, meaning to make something beautiful and true, and your human needs to become one and whole, why not do it? It's the easiest way to do it. And it's the way that will bring you in contact with others too, because one of the ways you start is the antiphonal form. So you leave your isolation as a written poet and you join with others, and you start to make this live butterfly in flight, It's the most incredible experience. So that's why I found myself, going back and then looking at Jane's and looking at Graves and saying, these guys are onto something here, that this is something that happens naturally, and it happened in a very early stage of our existence. And it's bound up in the emergence of the first mother goddess. That was the first form that the unknowable took, outside of animals, I would say, in our human consciousness, was the great mother goddess who gave birth, who taught us everything, who listened to us, right? Who mated with us, who would kill us if we got out of line. Humans can be very nasty, much more nasty than animals. We've seen them, how nasty they can get. Her job as mother was what all mothers to do, is to protect, to enrich, to enhance her children. And in fact, whatever she had to do that, she did. And one of the ways that she did it is, if you think of this in a kind of metaphorical way, is that the mother goddess gave birth to the muse. It's like Athena coming out of somebody's head. I forget that, or the limb or something. But the muse is a more human form of the mother goddess, who was a piece of work. You wouldn't want to meet her on a dark night. As much as she was revered, from some of the stories I've told you, this was not Betty Crocker. But the muse was somebody who was a sharing person, whereas in terms of the mother goddess was a guiding psychic force. This was a sharing psychic force. It was motherly. There was something of the emotion of love and sharing and of storytelling. That's, like my grandmother, let's all sit down and it's an invitation to be human is storytelling. It's everything. Without our stories, there would be nothing. There'd be no God. Nothing. No universe. We are the other half of creation, in that we create stories about creation. And without it, there would be no creation. There would just be is. There would just be the life force, Anyway, that's kind of getting off the beaten path here that I wanted to beat for you, so you know it. But that's the reason that I started to go back, and I started to see that it started at a very early stage, and it has developed, and we still have this within us. So once you understand that, you'll begin to understand how powerful poetry is. It's not just something that's done by snobs in universities, in these little quarterlies, and they have all their crazy ideas about what poetry should be. It's really unbelievable. Thank God we have some poets who have some sense, but there seem to be very few, to be frank about it, who are really writing from that deeper level, from that heart level, from that unconscious level, which is where all great poems have to start and where they have to be ended by the unconscious. You can play tricks all day long, but it's not going to come up with a poem that comforts us. It's like Yeats says, Hamlet and Lear are gay, and they're gay because that great tragedy comforts us. It says that we're a part of the mystery. We're not flotsam. We're a mysterious part of an unknowable mystery. That's all we get. That's the story, Laurie. But it's a good story. Not all the answers we'd like, but it's better than flotsam or jetsam. Take your pick, Accident, as the physicists would like us to believe, accidents. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so that's the answer to my friend. Is the same answer I would give if I were Socrates, whose answer was why he was always pulling things apart. And he said, because the unexamined life isn't worth living. I would say the same here. Once you see something that doesn't fit into the mold that you've been told, you have two choices. You can simply walk away from it and to live in a kind of dim life, or you can pull it apart to see where you've been misled by the previous discussion of what poetry is, or what art is, or what life is, whatever it happens to be. When your observations don't match the observations of the stories that have been handed to you, you can either go into the barn and sit in darkness, or you can go into the light and start to pull the little animals apart until you get to your answer. And I like to pull them apart. And until I get the answer that satisfies me, I don't stop. So that's what this long series is about. You can come in at any time, I think, and you can learn something. And if all you learn is that you learn to you question poetry as to what it is, come up with your own conclusions, do a little reading on it, take a look at the books I've produced. One is Alice Hickey. You'd like to take a look at that. You should take a look at that. It's won a prize. It's a pretty good prize. Okay, and the other one is Soul Speak: The Outward Journey, which tries to suggest that we can go inward as we do in terms of the mystics and in terms of the other exercises we do to become whole, or to get in touch with that earlier state of consciousness. All forms of meditation and yoga do that. People think they came from their modern inventions. They're just modern techniques to get back to where we were, and poetry is to get back to where we were. It's to invigorate or to re-enliven that little remnant that's within us that we can use to allow the muse or the unconscious to speak to us, and we can speak back. That's what poetry does. It's like a giant cycle, and the more you cycle it, the better off it is. I saw back years ago when I was going through all this, you can see it somewhat in the video in back of me, that kind of organic circular movement. I was watching a picture of the Earth, which was the fire was coming up into a crust, and then on the other side that the crust was going down inside the Earth. You can think of the crust as the conscious mind, and then it eventually goes back down into the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind comes up and makes the conscious mind. It goes on and on forever. It's the way everything works, and it's the way that we become whole, like the whole earth in a way. We allow that process to take place. And when we do, we become fully human, which means that we become godlike. Otherwise, we are flotsam. We're just a lot of brainy shitheads running around, telling extremely clever stories and finding new ways to damage each other. Really what we want to do is we want to return to a kind of wholeness, and poetry is a way to do that, although it's going against the current of today, which doesn't want to hear that. Oh God, we're going to think our way through this. You're not going to think your way through this. But I think we're in for a very dark period of American history, thanks to our friends from Islam, our fundamentalist friends. And in fact, dark angels always have an effect that's unexpected, and they're going to have it on us too. And how it's going to take form, I have no idea. But my sense of it is that it's going to bring us back to poetry, but through a very painful way. When we see that all of our clever ways haven't really got us anywhere in terms of who we are, which means we're headed for a lot of suffering, one way or another. And that only poetry allows us. It's the thing that for most people will engender a poem within them. Unfortunately, it shouldn't have to relate to that, go back to that, but that's what's going to happen. That's my feeling about it. But in the meantime, for those of you who are artistic and are disposed, poems can be made through mime, through dance, through singing, through words. You just have to allow it to happen. You have to allow the music to come up for you in the way that is most natural for you. No conscious thoughts. Let it complete itself. And in that completion, which is different than the feeling they came to you, it's now a human feeling. It goes back under the crust to the unconscious, and it's nourished. It becomes more human. It's like a brother. You know, I try to explain that the conscious and unconscious minds, that we're brothers. And like brothers, we have to respect them. We should admire them. We don't know if we can trust them all the time. They can be unpredictable, you know. And I'm sure the unconscious feels the same way about us, and that way, you know. But it shouldn't be disregarded and treated as trash. You never want to treat a brother as trash. You're in for a bad time if you do. All right, I think that's enough. So you have some feels. I want to just play something for you. Very simple poem. You'll hear in the back an antiphonal poem. What was happening? I was feeling very crummy one day. And I was sitting in my office where I'm sitting now. You can't see the whole of it because I have some stage settings here. I have a big glass window in the back. I can look out. I'm on the second floor and I can see what's happening. And what was happening is that I wasn't feeling right. Things were not going well with me, and I was getting very lonely. And I just clicked on the computer. I have a couple of computers in the office. I clicked on one to play some music, and I forgot that it had an antiphonal poem on it with myself and my partner. I didn't, but it just was playing, and I hit play, and I started to speak by looking at some pictures I had taken of the office just a few seconds before, and out came this poem. Shows you how quick the process is, and it requires no intervention of the conscious mind. When you come out of it, just like you do from sex, you can have a smoke or a drink of water. I went to the computer and I made sure it was stored, correctly. Here we go. See you next week. Sometimes when I look at myself from far, far away, I don't know who I'm looking at. It's a boy, or it's a picture, or it's something made of imagination, something shaped of wax guttered onto the table. I could live forever and not understand these words.
I don't know how it happened.
I cannot crush them with my hands or give them to you.
But it did.
They're only dust. What can I say to you?
Across the bridge.
You who are looking at me. What can I tell you?
And now I'm burning it.
What can you say to me? Here,
I was
in this room,
thinking of you.
On this afternoon,
I'm burning my bridges.
when nothing happens.
I can never go back.
Where I look out the window, and everybody is coming and going,
Look at you.
and only I have no name.
I was thinking of you.
Only
That
I
way again.
have no name at all.
I have to tell you.
I was thinking.